North American slave rebellions, late 17th century through the Civil War. The history of African Americans, my people, is littered with situations that are less than desirable to say the least. We can talk about the hardships until we are blue in the face. As a matter of fact, we already have for centuries. I think it's time to change the narrative, and we can start with the subject of North American slave rebellions, late 17th century, Civil War. I would like my readers to understand what a slave rebellion is, the magnitude and details of just a few of these rebellions, and I would like my readers to know the brave men who fought for freedom even at the cost of their own lives. Black people love freedom as much as the next person. I can't imagine another human being not understanding this. Bondage is only for people who intend or do harm on others. I was very surprised by the movie Gone with the Wind, because in the scene when the North invaded and was victorious, Miss Scarlett O'Hare started to weep when her slaves ran away after the South lost the battle. I don't see how she didn't know that people would want their freedom. She was living under an illusion. Poor woman. Furthermore, this article I am reading mentions how many slave rebellions there were in North America. I was surprised by the number. Slave rebellions were a continuous source of fear in the American South, especially since black slaves accounted for more than 1/3 of the region's population in the 18th century. Laws dictating when, where and how slaves could congregate were enacted to prevent insurrection and quell white paranoia. It's estimated there were at least 250 slave rebellions in America before slavery was abolished in 1865. Slave rebellions, Part 1. But of course, the question is, what counts as a slave rebellion? Let's investigate. We're gonna start with the very basics, the definition of the words. I'm not going to look up the word slave. I think it's too obvious to bother with. We are going to examine the word rebel, the definition and the etymology for the origin of the word, and to gain a greater understanding of the word, because the seriousness of a rebellion is contained within. Here we go. Pronunciation. Reb. L. Noun. Rebel, one, a person who rises in opposition or armed resistance against an established government or ruler. Etymology. Latin bellum, meaning war. Latin rebellus, French rebelle, Middle English rebel. Middle English, from Old French rebel, noun, rebeller, verb, from Latin rebellus, used originally with reference to a fresh declaration of war by the defeated, based on bellum, war. Dictionary.com definition of rebel. Those 250 rebellions could have been small or big, but it does establish war and opposition against a ruler, which is key to understanding actual slave rebellions. The first recorded rebellion took place in the 17th century. In 1672, there were reports of fugitive slaves forming groups to harass plantation owners. The first recorded all-black slave revolt occurred in Virginia in 1687. Slave rebellions, Part 5. From that point, slaves would look for opportunities to carve out a little freedom from somewhere, and hearing about fighters made them braver in the area of war. Great leaders of opposition emerged out of these incursions. Leaders like Denmark Vesey. He was one of the earliest to emerge and wanted his freedom. Influenced by other uprisings, he devised plans to free the blacks in his area. The title of the article is Slave Revolutionary. Denmark Vesey wanted his freedom. Slave Revolutionary Part 2. He prepared very detailed plans for the attack, and according to the report, it was very violent and calculated. He ultimately was caught and brought to trial. This date celebrates the life of Denmark Vesey in 1767. He was a black abolitionist who planned the most extensive slave revolt in U.S. history. In Charleston, SC in 1822, born Telemaque in St. Thomas, the Danish West Indies. He was sold in 1781 to a Bermuda slave captain named Joseph Vesey. Young Denmark, who was self-educated, assumed his master's surname, accompanied him on numerous voyages, and in 1783 settled with his owner in Charleston. In 1799, Vesey was allowed to purchase his freedom with $600 he had won in a street lottery. He was already familiar with the Great Haitian Slave Revolt of the 1790s. And while working as a carpenter, he read anti-slavery literature. Dissatisfied with his second-class status as a freedman and determined to help relieve the far more oppressive conditions of others he knew, Vesey planned and organized an uprising of city and plantation blacks. The plan reportedly called for the rebels to attack guardhouses and arsenals, seize their arms, kill all whites, burn and destroy the city, and free the slaves. As many as 9,000 blacks may have been involved, though some scholars dispute this figure. Warned by a house servant, white authorities on the eve of the scheduled outbreak made massive military preparations, which forestalled the rebellion. During the ensuing 2 months, some 130 blacks were arrested. In the trials that followed, 67 were convicted of trying to raise an insurrection. Of these, 35, including VC, were hanged, July 2, 1822, in Charleston, and 32 were condemned to exile. In addition, 4 white men were fined and imprisoned for encouraging the plot. Slave Revolutionary, page 1. Some were hung and others were not. I would have rather had exile than to be put to death, but people can't choose their own punishments last time I checked. Another slave revolt that took place is known as the biggest revolts by one of the most significant authorities in North America, the Smithsonian. Again, influenced by the Haitian Revolution, slaves took their tools and turned them on the big house of the plantation. It was early 1800s when this revolt happened in Louisiana, 205 years ago. On the night of January 8, 1811, more than 500 enslaved people took up arms in one of the largest slave rebellions in U.S. history. They carried cane knives, used to harvest sugar cane, hoes, clubs and some guns as they marched toward New Orleans chanting freedom or death. The uprising began on the grounds of a plantation owned by Manuel Andre on the east side of the Mississippi, in a region called the German coast of Louisiana. There, a slave driver named Charles Deslins of Haitian descent led a small band of slaves into the mansion of the plantation owners. The group then armed themselves with muskets and ammunition from the plantation's basement. Some donned Andre's militia uniforms. Charles knew that the uniforms would lend the revolt authority, reports historian Daniel Rasmussen in his book American Uprising, The Untold Story of America's Largest Slave Revolt, excerpted by NPR. Charles was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which had succeeded less than a decade before and brought encouragement to those revolting in Louisiana that night. Fessenden Par 1 through 3. The powers that be struck hard and fast to counteract anything the rebels accomplished in punishment by death was on the table. It wasn't enough for the establishment to just kill and banish the opposition. They actually made examples of these people to keep the others under control through fear. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, an author and historian at Michigan State University, tells Bacon Blood, it was incredibly bloodthirsty in the way the elite put it down, cutting people into little pieces, displaying body parts. The brief battle killed dozens of the fighting slaves. The surviving leaders were rounded up to face a tribunal on January 13 and many were sentenced to death by firing squad. Their heads were cut off and placed on poles along the river in order to frighten and intimidate the other slaves, writes Waters for the Zinn Project. This display of heads placed on spikes stretched over 60 miles. The suppression of the extent of the rebellion kept the uprising from historical attention for decades. Hall calls it a kind of historical amnesia. Fessenden, page 2. I know the establishment have systems in place to deal with these things, but they also employed very primitive tactics to really get into the minds of the slaves, and if I had to bet I would say they didn't want any more slave revolts. Unfortunately for them, the rebellions would continue for a great number of years to follow. The next leader I want to discuss is Gabriel Prosser. He was a very competent man with knowledge in enough areas to where he was able to make money. Gabriel was a skilled artisan with several advantages over most field-working slaves of his day. As an artisan, Gabriel was among the broad group of urban workers whose actions played a crucial role causing the American Revolution. As an African American and a slave, the benefits of the Revolution were not extended to Gabriel. The Revolution and the anti-elitist thrust of the Democratic Republicans helped shape Gabriel's vision in leading a slave revolt. Gabriel's rebellion, page 1-2. From what I read, he had valid concerns. They gave him credit for his actions that sparked the American Revolution, yet he gets none of the benefits simply because he is technically a slave. The entire town used his services, and when you are doing business with someone you tend to treat them with decency, so I can see how he got confused as far as his equality in society. When he learned the truth, he obviously got upset enough to take action. Gabriel, still slightly confused though ready to take steps toward his freedom, actually thought that poor whites would fight with him. Gabriel, and a small group of artisan leaders, expected about 1,000 slaves to follow them in a well-coordinated attack upon Richmond that targeted Federalists and merchants who were the most prominent residents of the city. Gabriel expected the poor white people as well as the most redoubtable Republicans to join his cause to create a more democratic republic in Virginia. He especially identified Quakers, Methodists, and Frenchmen as those whites who were most friendly to liberty. The purpose of the rebels was clearly expressed in a banner under which they planned to march, which eloquently stated death or liberty. The assault plan for August 30, 1800, however, never came together. Torrential rain caused confusion and a traitor from within the group warned white authorities of the impending attack. Gabriel's Rebellion, page 2. It seems that that's why most African American plans for freedom don't work, because there will be a traitor in every camp. The more I research, I see this same thing throughout history. Blacks selling out other blacks. It is really a sad thing. It even happened in the Civil Rights era. The Black Panthers was taken down by inside information traitors gave up to the powers that be. According to the article, his actions had many after effects, some good for blacks and some bad for black. Now many whites began to think that making the system slightly more humane had encouraged black resistance. As a result, some of the advantages that slaves like Gabriel possessed were made illegal. For instance, literacy and allowing slaves to hire out for work in varied settings became illegal. Similarly, the Virginia legislature attempted to prevent enslaved people from piloting boats, a position from which they could travel to freely and learn about changes in the outside world that threatened white masters. This newly repressive slave system was a tragic outcome for African American collective action that had intended to liberate slaves. The reinvigorated slave societies of the South thrived in the 19th century and only ended with the massive violence of the Civil War. Green, page 1. The last great leader of slave rebellions I need to talk about is Nat Turner, probably the most popular of all the rebels. He led a revolt in Virginia in 1831. In an article entitled Horrid Massacre in Virginia, Nat Turner's Revolt, Nat Turner led a revolt known as the most dangerous rebellion in North American history according to this article. On the evening of August 21 to 22, 1831, an enslaved preacher and self-styled prophet named Nat Turner launched the most deadly slave revolt in the history of the United States. Over the course of a day in Southampton County, Turner and his allies killed 55 white men, women, and children as the rebels made their way toward Jerusalem, Virginia, now Cortland. Less than 24 hours after the revolt began, the rebels encountered organized resistance and were defeated in an encounter at James Parker's farm. Following this setback, Turner and other rebels scrambled to reassemble their forces. The next day, a series of defeats led to the effective end of the revolt. Green, page 3. Nat Turner didn't just grab weapons and attack, he had philosophies and strategies. The article also has some of his ideas in it. The section is called The Confessions of Nat Turner. Keeping the revolt small meant that whites would not uncover the conspiracy, but keeping it small created a new hurdle for the rebels. They had to figure out how to get slaves and free blacks who had not heard about the revolt to join them. Turner recalled the conspirators thought hard about this problem. Many were the plans formed and rejected by us, he noted in the Confessions, but with little success. Green, page 1. The revolt had after effects in Southampton and outside of Southampton, and some effects that may have even led to Emancipation Proclamation because of the steps the states took after the rebellion. The revolt had important ramifications outside of Southampton, as several Southern communities feared that slaves in their community were part of the revolt. In Richmond, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the grandson of Thomas Jefferson, tried but failed to convince the General Assembly to enact a plan that would have put the state on the path to gradual emancipation. Green, page 1. The effects for the slaves of Southampton was bad. Southampton court system would ultimately decide what to do with suspected slave rebels. Trials began on August 31, 1831, and the majority of trials were completed within a month. By the time that the trials were finished the following spring, 30 slaves and 1 free black had been condemned to death. Green, page 1. Nat Turner was a leader who they just shot a movie of called Birth of a Nation a couple of years ago. Thank you for watching, and please, like and subscribe.